Thanks so much for joining me this evening. We've got until the top of the next hour together. My hope is to leave 15 to 20 minutes at least for Q&A at the end. I do cover a bunch of material, and we're going to do a couple of exercises during the presentation to keep it a bit more interactive. Nothing too crazy, but there will be one quick thing where you'll be paired up with somebody for a couple of minutes just to have a quick discussion. Then we'll come back, we'll share back, and we'll move forward. Everything else will be done here in the main screen. But I'm super excited to be here and talk about Forever Employable. So as Imran mentioned, Forever Employable is my fourth book, and it's the one. If you look at the other three, you could ask two questions. Number one is, how does this make sense? Because the first book was Lean UX, which was how to do UX design in an agile environment. The second one was Sense and Respond, which is how do you kind of increase the agility of an organization from a leadership perspective. The third one was a reconciliation of lean, agile, and design thinking in a very short pamphlet. Then you got Forever Employable and kind of wonder, like, how does that make sense and all that? That's a fair question. The other thing you might ask yourself before we kick into the material tonight is, well, what does this have to do with Agile? And that's a really good question as well. And so I'll give you the punchline now about kind of what this has, how this kind of came out of the other three books and what this has to do with Agile, and then we'll jump right into the presentation. But the short of it is this. Everything that I have learned over the years doing product design, product management, digital transformation, and business agility work, obviously can be applied to product. And it can also be applied to process and to culture and the way that you build an organization. One of the interesting things is, how do we take those same principles and those same ideas and we apply them to our career and to our professional development with a very specific goal of redefining the level of control that we have over that career and redefining the measures of success for our career and our professional development. And so what you'll notice as I tell you the story here in the next few minutes is that there are a lot of ideas that come straight out of product development, product management, Agile, Scrum, that type of thing, Lean UX for that matter, product discovery. But the context is career. And the point of it is, again, to sort of kind of, as the subtitle says, it's how to stop looking for work, how to stop chasing work and really let our create this inbound flow of opportunities so that we can then decide how to best move our career forward. So that's the plan for the presentation today. I'm going to share my screen with you so you can see some of these slides, and yeah, and then we'll go from there. Excellent. Let me just adjust my view here so I can see most of you and the things that I need to see do my presentation. Excellent. So that was the setup really for this. Now, the story that I'm going to tell you, the book is, interesting enough, the book it's about me, which is perhaps a bit narcissistic, but it's semi-autobiographical in the sense that it starts on the day that I turned 35 years old. Now, the day that I turned 35 years old was January 31st, 2008. And I woke up on the morning of January 31st, 2008 in a cold sweat, in a bit of a panic. I was really kind of freaking out, and I didn't know why. It's my birthday. I love birthdays. Really, I do like my, and I was trying to figure out why I was freaking out. Like, why did I wake up in a cold sweat? What was the issue? And I couldn't really figure it out. And kind of sort of trying to assess everything up until this point, if you kind of looked at it, things were pretty good for me when I was 35, right? No real complaints. This is me at 35, so slightly more hair, not a whole lot, like at that point, there's a lost cause. Those are my daughters who are now 18 and 14. One is going to uni in Scotland here in 2 weeks, which is very, very sad and exciting at the same time, right? But 2 kids, everything's going well. And up until that point, everything had gone pretty well. I started off, in college and beyond as a broke musician. I played in bands in America on the East Coast. And when I got tired of being broke, the internet came along, coincidentally, which was really nice. And what was really nice about Web 1.0, if you remember, is that nobody knew what they were doing, which was great for me because I had some very basic HTML and graphic design skills at that point. But I got my first job on the internet. And back then in 1999, if you could spell HTML, you could get a job. And that was great in Web 1.0. And I could do a little bit more than spell it. I could do some markup and do some basic graphic design. I was designing sites for my band and stuff. And so I got my first job on the internet, right? And that was great. So I was coming out of being a broke musician. I've got a salary. Somebody comes into work, one of the bosses comes into work one day and they show us this book. This is Information Architecture for the World Wide Web. Originally written by Peter Morville and Lou Rosenfeld. This book is now in its 4th edition, 22 years later. And they've got a 3rd author who's helped out with it since then. But this was the 1st edition. And they said, who wants to be an information architect? And all of us said, what's an information architect? No one, we didn't know. It was 1999, right? And they said, well, we've got this book. Read this book. Who wants to read the book? I said, I'll read the book. Took the book home, came back and said, this is great. This is for me, because what it did was we were doing waterfall development back then, right? And so what that book did is it moved me further upstream in the waterfall, whereas my day job of HTML and graphic design was all the decisions have been made, just implement the static website, right, and make it happen. Now they're saying, hey, you can come upstream and make some decisions about organization and naming schemes and that type of thing. I said, great, that's what I want to do. And so I finally had a career path. I had a direction. I went down this particular career path and information architecture, which as the web became a bit more robust, into interaction design and UX design. And I ran headlong into the .com bubble, right? Collapse, which if you were there, you remember. And it was a little rough, bounced around for a little while. But landed on my feet mostly, found myself at America Online. In the mid 2000s, early 2000s to be fair, found myself working on the software, designing the software that went on these CDs. And in the UK, you were lucky enough to get these CDs from us, so you're welcome. I worked on these. If you ever received any of these things in the mail or bought them, I probably worked on the software on them, and I did that for a while. I moved to the West Coast, started increasing my levels of responsibility, right? So following the career path, right? So I started off as an individual contributor at Web Trends, the analytics company in Portland, Oregon. I started managing my first team. I moved back to New York, to the West Coast, to the East Coast, right around my 35th birthday, and I'm now leading a much bigger team, a more diverse, from a discipline perspective, team at the Ladders, which is a high growth startup. And so about 10 years into my career, I'd clawed my way up to middle management, right? So 10 years in, really followed the traditional career path, really, like got a job, got a little, increase in responsibility, salary, just kept making these lateral moves, even with the .com stuff kind of getting in the way. And so I'm waking up on my 35th birthday. I'm the director of user experience at the Ladders. Really have no idea kind of what it is. And then it dawns on me why I woke up in that cold sweat and in that panic. Now, I'm a hiring manager, and my background has now been 10 years of design. And what was happening is I was hiring folks onto my teams, and the folks that I was hiring, they were younger than me, they were better than me, they were faster than me, and they were hungrier than me. At this point, I had 2 kids, little kids, I had to be home, I had to work a lot. And I was terrified that in 5 years, so I was 35, right? So back then, in 5 years from then, I'll be 40, I'll be too expensive and unemployable. And that's really, really what worried me. And that was the cold sweat and the panic, was that I was going to wake up in 5 years and not be able to feed my family. And that was really worrying to me. And that's the cause of the cold sweat on that morning. And so on that morning, I resolved to change that. I resolved to change the dynamics of my career and my professional development. And I was going to completely change the way that we think about professional development, career development. I was no longer going to look for jobs, because in my opinion, this was going to be an increasingly losing proposition as I got older, right? So up until 35, I was fairly successful at getting the jobs I went for, but I really was concerned, having seen some friends of mine who were older and other colleagues, that this was something I was going to start losing. And so instead, I was going to shift the dynamic around 180 degrees, right? So instead of me chasing them, jobs were going to look for me. That was the resolution that I made on the morning of my 35th birthday. And I know what you're thinking. You're like, wow, Jeff, that's absolutely mind-blowing. But it brings up some pretty tough questions. You can say all those words, but you have to actually start to ask the tough questions after you say, I resolve to have jobs find me. Right? It's not enough, right? So the questions that came up immediately after this resolution. Question number one, well, if jobs are going to find me, does anybody know who I am? Right? They have to actually be aware that I exist. And I would argue that in 2008, aside from a LinkedIn profile, I wasn't convinced that people knew who I was. Why would they look for me? So if people are going to look for me, what is it that I can help them with? What is it that they need from me that I can provide? What problem do I help them solve? And that was a big question that I needed to think through. How would they find me is another question, right? We had Google, 2008, right? It's not prehistoric times. We had Google, we had LinkedIn, all these things, right? I had an online profile. How else? Where did I want them to find me? And then really, most importantly, what kind of work do I want? So if people know who I am and they understand what problem I solve for them and how to find me, right? Are they going to bring me the kind of work that I want? Because I don't want just all kinds of random stuff coming. I want specific things that I actually enjoy doing, that I feel like make a difference, right? And that was a big deal for me to really think all of this through. And so before we move further, I'm going to ask you to think through one of these questions, okay? And so we're going to do a quick challenge and take a little break. You can pause from me speaking, give you a chance to talk to each other for a second, then we'll come back together as a group. But the challenge is to think through this question, right? Why would jobs look for you? In other words, what problem or problems do you help people solve? And so here's the way this is going to work. You're going to work together. David is going to break you out into random breakout rooms. So you're going to get up one partner in that breakout room. Maybe it's somebody you've met, maybe it's somebody you've talked to tonight, maybe it's not, okay? I want you to just take 1 minute each, introduce yourselves. Don't use more than 1 minute because you only have a total of 10 minutes in there together, okay? And then 10 minutes to work together in the breakout room. And then we're going to ask you to share back just a little bit. Now, here's the prompt for that question, right? Your prompt that you want to talk through with this other person and have them ask you some challenging questions is, what problem do you help people solve? Now, what happens is when we do this particular exercise, right, this is usually the progression of the conversation, right? Somebody say, I'll say, well, what problem do you help people solve? And they'll say, well, I'm a project manager or an Agile coach. Okay, cool. That's your job title. Terrific. What problems does a project manager help people solve? I help bring projects in on time and on budget. Good. Right. Now let's do a kind of an even better, kind of a deeper pass at that and say, look, really what I do is I ensure everyone on my team is at their most creative, productive, and successful without burning out. Right. You could argue that that's what a project manager does. That's the problem that they help solve. Right. And so what I want you to do is to kind of push a little deeper beyond your job title and look beneath to the value that you bring and try to come up with the problem that you're best in the world at solving. Okay, so that's the challenge. David is gonna ship you off into breakout rooms. You're gonna have a total of 10 minutes. Then the rooms will close, and then we'll come back. We'll do some sharing back, and then we'll move forward with the conversation and the story. Okay. Any questions about what we're asking you to do?
Okay, well, I'm going to open the rooms now.
Excellent. I think we got everybody back. Excellent. Very good. Before we move forward, I would love to do a little bit of sharing back, just to kind of hear from maybe 2 or 3 people max, sort of how your conversation went and where you netted out. So basically, what was your answer to the question? What problem do you help people solve? Would anyone like to volunteer and share where they ended up in their conversation? Pradum.
Hi. Yes, I'm happy to share the conversation what myself and Mohammed is having.
Please, go ahead.
So, and Mohammed really challenged me to think a little bit deeper and deeper the conversation as we went through. And I stuck on the level 2. And the problem I stated when I gave him, the problem I'm trying to solve is helping my team to understand and to solve the customer problems, so that they're obsessed with solving customer problems, not just developing the solution.
Mm-hmm.
And next level was defining why and what, not going into the how element perspective. And when Mohammed pushed me a little bit deeper, can we go one more level down? And I said, I'm struggling. And then Mohammed started sharing his view. I got and I thought was, okay, the next level is there where I can say how can I do it, how I'm doing it, and how I've done in the past. So that was very fruitful conversation, like helping the team on the flow, so nothing to stop, and bring the alignment within the organization or the team members, how to handle impediments coming on their way, and might be empowering them at the end so that they can make their own decisions. So just one statement what I begin with, like helping our team to solve the customer problems, is gone to, I would say, a couple of lines into the third level when we're having the conversation.
Got it. Great, nicely done, right? And that's great, right? So first of all, it's well, I help my team. Well, I help my team do what? I help them focus on solving customer problems rather than delivering features. Excellent, good, right? Ultimately, you could get to a point where you could say, like, I help bring companies closer to their customers, or something along those lines, right? Or we help, whatever, right? But the point is really to get to that problem statement that you're solving for. And what's nice, and we talked about this with James a little bit, because James was sort of in our breakout room in here, is that when you distill the thing that you do into the real value that it brings, right? So with James, we talked about how he facilitates successful communication within a specific context across diverse teams. In your case, you're bringing companies closer to their customers, right? You can then take that value statement and you can apply it in many more contexts, right? When we look at our job title, like the job title says, Scrum Master, IT Project Manager, or whatever it is, right? It feels like we have to apply it only in this context. But when you boil it down to the value, all of a sudden, right, that sort of base value is applicable in a variety of different contexts, right? You could bring companies closer to their customers, not just in tech, you can do it in really in any industry, right? And so that all of a sudden opens up a whole new set of opportunities for you as well. So it's really good to think about it that way. Nicely done, and thank you for sharing. Let's do one more, and then we'll keep moving forward. Anybody else want to share? Thank you for sharing. Anybody else?
Sure, I'll do it.
Go ahead, Neil.
Okay, so what problem do you help solve? I help software-focused companies think holistically around quality beyond just functional correctness.
Excellent. And so where did you start? Like, what was the beginning of that conversation?
So we sort of started right there, largely because I've been doing quite a bit of thinking about this recently. So that was my sort of go-to. I didn't want to say I am a test engineer, or I didn't want to start from the job roles. I wanted to go a bit more deeper in terms of what I think I help businesses solve from that aspect.
Yeah, and I think that's great, right? Because I think again, if you said QA or test engineer or something along those lines, immediately they put you in a box, right? There's like, okay, you do this thing, right? But if you broaden it out to, look, I ensure that the quality goes well beyond the code and into customer experience, or whatever, that all of a sudden broadens your appeal, employability, and the contexts within which you can apply some of this stuff. So great. Nicely done. Thank you for sharing. That's fantastic. Good. Folks, think about that as we continue to move forward. I just want to give you a chance to think through that question as we start to work through some of this. What's interesting is that for me, the starting to answer those 4 questions and really trying to get to a point where I was no longer going to look for jobs and jobs were going to look for me, ended up at this idea that I would need to create a platform for myself and use it as a magnet to continuously pull in opportunities. So if you think about sort of take a systems thinking approach to this conversation, right? Traditional career is a push model. You push yourself into a job interview or an application, into an interview, and you relinquish control to somebody else. They decide if you get accepted. They decide if you get the interview. They decide if you get the job, the promotion, the raise, whatever it is, right? What we want to do is we want to reverse that so that we're constantly pulling on the system. So it's a pull system that's continuously attracting opportunities. And for me, the way to do that was to think about that core value, that conversation that we just had, and then to build a platform around it. And really the only way that I knew how to build that platform was to take my expertise, the things that I knew how to do, that I was passionate about, the experience that I'd had in my career up until that time, create content from that expertise, and then use that content to build an audience, to build a network, does anybody know who I am, right? The idea is to say, yes, people know who I am because they read my content about the thing that I help them do, the thing that I'm good at, and the problem that I help them solve. And it's through that platform that we start to generate those inbound opportunities. That's what I knew how to do. And so I set out to do that on my 35th birthday, if you'll recall. I spent the next 10 years since then, 13 years now, since then, building and maintaining that platform. And over that time, I kind of dawned on me a couple of things. So I discovered along the way that there were 5 qualities within myself that I needed to demonstrate in order to become forever employable, to build this kind of continuous inbound flow of opportunities, right? The second was there were 5 specific steps that I took to get there, and I continue to follow these steps as the thing that I do and offer expands. And ultimately where this netted out for me, and again, coming back to the introduction, is that we have to think of our career and our professional development as a product or as a service, as a thing that we provides value to users or to customers. And we have to understand those needs, even as they evolve over time, and adjust our product and adjust our offering so that people are constantly asking for the thing that we provide, the product or the service that we provide, right? So let's talk about each one of these things and let's go through each one. So first of all, the five qualities that I've found within myself to becoming forever employable are these, and it's entrepreneurialism, self-confidence, continuous learning, improvement, and reinvention. Now, a lot of these may sound familiar, particularly to a group like this, because these are a lot of the same qualities you'd find in Agile teams or teams who are attempting to achieve a greater sense of agility, right? But again, instead of focusing these qualities on products, you're focusing them on yourself, your career, and your professional development. So look, let's take a look at each one. So entrepreneurialism. This was a really tough one for me because I never thought of myself as an entrepreneur. I was never the ideas guy. I was always the execution guy. You had a good idea, I'll help you get it done. And so I was looking for experiences in my life that may help me sort of channel some entrepreneurial spirit. Well, I told you I played in bands. Bands are startups. I played in bands for a long time. And I was the guy who managed the bands as well as played in the bands. And bands are startups. You're an entrepreneur. You have a crazy idea. You and your friends have a crazy idea. You think it's going to change the world. You pour everything you have into that. You identify a target market. You start do marketing and sales and promotions, and you hope to build a sustainable business out of it. I did this for a long time. So I actually had entrepreneurial experience. I just didn't see it as that because it wasn't a startup per se. Right. Self-confidence was really interesting, right? Self-confidence was look, if I'm going to put myself out there, I got to be fairly confident that I know what I'm talking about. And that's a tough one, right? I was looking for experiences in my life that proved to me that I could overcome any situation and really build that self-confidence. Well, it turns out I had that experience in my life because in the summer of 1995, I joined the circus, and I spent 6 months on the road traveling with this particular circus. These are my photos from that time in America. And I lived in that lorry, as you say in the UK, it's a truck. There on the left, the one that has the name of the circus on it, with 7 other dudes. The 8 of us lived in there for 6 months. And it was a weird place. It was a subculture of 200 people. And I had to figure out not only how to survive, but how to thrive and be successful at my job. And I spent 6 months figuring it out and really came out the other end feeling much, much more confident about putting myself out there and learning how to navigate new experiences. And so I leaned into that to really start to feel better about putting my ideas out online and blog posts and that type of thing. Continuous learning was something that had been inherent in my life and in my career as well. I mentioned to you a bit earlier that I got this book and it taught me about information architecture, which taught me about UX design. But really, this is a quality about just staying current, reading, speaking with others, engaging in community like we're doing tonight, and always sort of consuming new information so that you always understand what's happening and where sort of the markets are heading, where technology is heading, where demand is heading. It's really, really important. Otherwise, you're going to be offering a service that doesn't make sense anymore. Again, I'll give you an example. I mean, there was years ago now when I still living in New Jersey, I'd ride the train into New York City. Every day I'd go into work at the Ladders. And there was this graphic designer that I'd met on the train, one of the dads in my suburban town. And he was adamant that he was just going to stick with print graphic design, and this is like 2007, 2008. And he's like, no, I'm just going to do print graphic design. I said, you're going to be out of a job really soon if you're not going to learn how to do some digital graphic design as well, right? So we got to pay attention to where things are going and then use that learning to continuously improve, right? To always get better, to always hone and sharpen what you're actually offering. And look, this comes with a heavy dose of humility, right? Because you have to admit that you're not perfect. You're not doing, like, there's always a better way to do this. And one of the ways that I do this very, very often is I do a lot of workshops and a lot of training, and I teach with other people. So the photo that's on the screen right now, this is the last time I taught in front of people in a room with them in the same place. This was March 13th last year. This was in Paris, and I was teaching a certified Scrum product owner course with my friend Jeff Patton. I teach with Jeff Patton a lot because I learn from Jeff Patton. He and I teach basically the same stuff, but we teach it differently, and we come from different experiences. And I learn and I get better this way, so my personal skills improve as well, right? And then lastly, the thing that's really, really important in this last of these qualities of becoming forever employable is this idea of reinvention, right? So what got you here isn't necessarily going to get you there. And this was coming out of the conversation that we just had about what problem you help people solve, right? So how do we take the things that we do and the things that we're good at and continuously reinvent ourselves in new relevant ways, or in different markets or in different target audiences, right? So an example of that is this HBR post that I wrote, this HBR article that I wrote, which just talks about bringing product thinking to non-product teams. I do a tremendous amount of my work with product development teams, engineers and designers and product managers and Scrum masters and Agile coaches, right? Everything that we teach them is absolutely relevant to teams that don't traditionally think of themselves as making a product, like HR or finance or legal, compliance, marketing, etc. And so one thing that I've been actively doing is trying to have a conversation around bringing product thinking to non-product teams like HR and legal and finance. And that's in an effort to make sure that I've always got sort of another market where people become aware of me, what I offer, maybe some intriguing ideas, and we start to see some of those inbound requests start to come in. So it's really about kind of continuously repositioning and reinventing yourself so that you're very, very relevant. Now, I'm curious. I'm going to ask you, we're going to launch a poll here, and so I'm going to ask the folks at Agile Northlands to launch the poll here. I'm just curious, with the folks that we have in the room this evening, what do you believe is your strongest quality from these 5 forever employable qualities: entrepreneurialism, self-confidence, continuous learning, improvement, and reinvention? Can we launch the poll and see what happens?
David, you want to do it?
We've not got the poll ready to go, unfortunately.
No.
So
Here, I got
whether
it.
we can come back to this slide.
I launched it as co-host. There it is.
Fantastic.
Excellent. Folks, go ahead and vote real quick. There's 25 people in a room. I can't vote as a host, so 22 people can vote. All right. Almost got everybody to vote on this. Let's see. So, which is your strongest quality? Continuous learning. Excellent. That doesn't surprise me in an Agile meetup. That's excellent. I kind of, I think ultimately that'd be probably a little disappointed if that wasn't at least in the top 2, which is good. What's really interesting, and I see self-confidence is always super low. It doesn't matter who I talk to about this, or doesn't matter. There's no like regional thing. Self-confidence is always really low. And it's one of the things that I hope that by the end of this conversation, I'll give you some ideas about how to start to test some of your ideas so that your self-confidence can hopefully go up about that. So thanks for sharing this. Sorry, I didn't realize you guys didn't see the results. These are the actual results of the poll. Okay. So those are the 5 qualities. Let's talk about the 5 steps to becoming forever employable. These are the 5 steps that I took to get to the point where I was able to write this book and tell this particular story. So let's look at each one of these and talk about it. So step 1, and we started having this conversation with what problem do you help people solve, is planting a flag. Now, planting a flag is deciding what is the foundation for your platform. What do you want to be known for? What do you hope people will know you for, right? And there's people who've done this particularly well, right? So if I put their names up on screen, right, especially with this group, pretty quickly you can say, well, Eric RIES, he's Lean Startup. That was his flag. That's where he planted his flag. Jake KNAPP, my buddy out in Seattle, planted his flag around design sprints, right? He literally wrote the book on design sprints. Our friend Alex over in Switzerland, we know him to be the business model generation and the business model canvas guy. We've got Seth Godin. Seth Godin is a marketing guru, right? And then if you kind of go a little bit further, this was my flag, basically. Lean UX is where I planted my original flag, which was how did you design in an Agile environment? And so you might ask yourself, well, how do I figure out where to plant my flag? That's really important to me. And there's a couple ways to do that. The first is the conversation that we just had about what problem do I help people solve? There's another really good exercise that I discovered, sadly, after the book was published. And so this exercise is not in the book, but it is on my website. So this is a Westernization of a Japanese concept called ikigai. If you look up the original ikigai, it looks like this, but the questions in each circle are a little different. This is a Westernized version of ikigai, which is your reason for being. It's the kind of your meaning, why you get out of bed every morning. Now, I actually really like this version of this exercise. I think it's more relevant to the conversation we're having today. And what's happening here is the idea is that there are 4 questions in this exercise. And you answer each of these questions, and then you try to find answers that actually tick all 4 boxes. And so the questions are, what do you love? Right? I love designing, and I love teaching, and I love basketball, and I love playing piano, and all the things that you love, right? What are you good at? Which is not necessarily the same thing, right? You could love playing piano, you might not be that good at it, right? It's okay, right? So what do you love? And there might be things that you're good at that you don't love, right? Like there's stuff happens like that all the time, right? What do you love? What are you good at? What does the world need right now, right? So what are sort of the needs of the world, right? Of the business world, the IT world, the Agile world, the world as a whole, right? And then the final question is, what can you be paid for? And the idea, again, is to answer each one of these questions individually and continue to answer and hone in and refine until you can land on at least one or maybe a couple of things that land right there in the middle. That answer all this. This is something that I love. I'm good at it. The world needs it, and I can get paid for it, right? And if you can nail that, that's usually a great place to start planting your flag, to say, look, this is going to be the foundation for what I'm going to be known for my platform, for my opportunity magnet, the thing I'm going to build, right? I'm going to build an audience around this. So there's a blog post on my blog about this, and you can grab the template there if you want to run this particular exercise. That was step one. Step two is to tell your story. If you've planted your flag, your goal is to become a storyteller and really share what you know about that idea with anyone who will listen. Right? Now, this is where a lot of folks get stuck, and this happens all the time. And the question becomes, well, what unique story do I have? We get stuck in our heads and we let doubt take over because everyone's got good experience, right? She has more to offer than I do. My story isn't extraordinary, certainly not enough to be unique and shared. And what's interesting about this is that the best part of your experience and of your story is not whether or not you've run an ultra marathon or built a massive company or work with celebrities, right? The best part about your story is that nobody else has it, right? If it feels like everything's been said on the internet, everything's been said on the internet except your story, right? No one has told it, right? You are the only person that can tell that story. And that's where you start because you're the only person who's gone through everything you have in the ways and at the times that you have, right? Your perspective is unique. And so that's a great place to start is by telling your story. And that's exactly what I did particularly with Lean UX. I started telling my story to anyone who would listen. I started giving talks, right? Now this is the first time I gave a talk about UX and Agile at all. And the date's important because remember, the cold sweat panic thing happened on January 31st, 2008. So 2.5 years later, right? I am starting to have a public conversation about the thing that I planted my flag in, which is UX and Agile. A month later, I spoke at a conference in Paris, and that's where first time I ever said Lean UX on stage was September 24th, 2010. And again, this is 2.5 years since then. This stuff takes time. And I really didn't get my big break until March 7th, 2011. In March 7th, 2011, Smashing Magazine published this article that I wrote for them, and it's called Lean UX, Getting Out of the Deliverables Business. Now, at the time, 10 years ago, Smashing Magazine had 1 million readers. It's a web design magazine authority at this point. Today, they've got tons more. But this conversation, I've been giving small talks at meetups and whatever and conferences. This took the conversation global all of a sudden, right? Because all of a sudden, 1 million people have access to this new content, and that's changing everything, right? All of a sudden, I have an opportunity to tell my story at more and more conferences, and I'm using that momentum to really take advantage of all the other channels that are available to me to test and learn which ones resonate the most and have the biggest audience. So I'm tweeting, I'm writing on Medium, I'm on Quora, I'm on LinkedIn, Facebook for a little while as well, building a mailing list, which is very, very important, on MailChimp, and running these experiments to figure out how to best reach my audience. Frankly, the only thing we stopped short of channel that we tried was Lean UX the musical. We thought about that very briefly, decided that that would be a bad idea, and so we didn't do Lean UX the musical. But in hindsight, kind of trying to understand why that particular story resonated, right? If you're going to tell a story, why did that story resonate? And it resonated for a few very specific reasons. Number one is it solved a real problem many people had. Tons of teams around the world, even to this day, are struggling with doing great design work in an Agile environment, Okay, so I'm talking about something that is a problem for a lot of people. There's an audience for this, right? I had actual real world experience. I was doing the work with my team, with my colleagues, with meetups and conferences and other folks, right? I was figuring this out. And the material that I was sharing, the blog posts and the talks at events were humble, right? I didn't just talk about, hey, we nailed this, we're awesome. We talked about, hey, we tried this, it was a disaster. Right? It was a humble sharing. Like, this worked, this didn't work, here's what we learned from it. And everything provided practical, tactical advice every single time. Right? Here's what you can try, here's what you can do. And that really, really helps in building that authentic connection with your target audience, right? So really solving a problem that they have and being very practical and humble about how it is that they should go about it. So I've planted my flag, I'm telling my story. The next step is to follow the new path. And this is where things get a little scary, right? Because if you're doing this well and you're succeeding, you start to generate new opportunities. And it's those new opportunities that start to pull you in different directions. And these directions might not be super comfortable for you because they're going to pull you off the path that you're currently on. So for me, I was doing design work, and then Lean UX starts to kind of become popular, and I start to do less and less design work. And if you remember how this conversation started, I was already worried that my skill sets were atrophying, that there were much better designers coming in, that they were younger, cheaper, faster than me. And I was really worried about them being pulled, doing less and less design work, because right now I'm flying all over the place and I'm giving talks and I'm teaching workshops and everybody wants to hear about Lean UX. Now, what's interesting is that, again, this is where the opportunities come from. This is where the new paths arrive. So, for example, it turns out that book publishers, they go to conferences and they look for speakers and topics that are current and interesting and that a lot of people are paying attention to. And it's just so happened that UX and Agile was a big one. And I got offered the opportunity to write the Lean UX book at a conference, which was interesting. That was going to pull me even further away from doing day-to-day design work. Right? But I jumped in and I said, yes, I'm going to do this. I'm going to follow this new path. I just didn't tell the publisher a very, very important secret, which was I had no idea how to write a book. Like, really, just literally no idea how to do it. Right. And this is the thing. These new paths are going to be scary, but you got to take the risk, right? If you're going to build this platform, if you're going to try some of this stuff out, you got to give it a shot. And admittedly, it was very, very, very hard to do this. Now, look, you'll say, well, Jeff, you were super lucky, right? To get that book deal. And you're right. I was super lucky, but I absolutely believe that we can be even more lucky in life if we're ready for those opportunities, if we're ready to follow those new paths, right? I really like this particular quote from Seneca, right? Which is, we want to be prepared for these opportunities, for these new paths to open up. But sure enough, look, writing that book, I didn't know how to do it, was brutal. It took me a long time. It took 2 years to get it done. I burned through 3 editors and I wrote the book 4 times, start to finish, because they hated it the first 3 times. And rightfully so. I was terrible at writing. And then finally, on March 11th, 2013, I am now 40 years old. I'm officially old by my standards, right? 5 years have passed. Lean UX gets published and it blows up, right? Lean UX has fundamentally transformed my life because I talked about it for so long. When the book finally came out, there was such an appetite for it, right? That we were able to sell tons of copies. Since then, we have published the 2nd edition of this book in 2016. And in fact, the 3rd edition of this book is coming out in the next month. So 10 years later, 10 years since we submitted the manuscript anyway, there's still an appetite for this, and we're still writing this particular book and telling these particular stories, right? So we're following this new path. Turned out to be incredibly, incredibly helpful to my career, right? But again, it takes time to get there. So you've planted your flag, you're telling your story, you're following these new paths. The next thing is to start to teach your ideas. Now, if you would have asked me 15 years ago what I'd be doing in 15 years, the last thing I would have told you was teaching. And yet, Everything I do today is teaching, whether it's workshops or conferences or webinars or podcasts or the stuff we're doing right now, right? Everything I'm doing, all the writing, all the training, it's all teaching. And I say yes to all of it because when you teach, you get feedback on your material. You learn how to improve your storytelling. You understand where that story is resonating, where it could use updating, where there's new content opportunities, right? And so there's a real opportunity to get better at your storytelling by signing up for all this stuff. Now, you see all this stuff and you're like, well, Jeff, you're independent or you're freelance, right? You can do this as an in-house employee as well. There's absolutely no reason why you can't take advantage of a variety of in-house opportunities to start to get better at telling your story and sharing your expertise. It builds your brand inside your organization and then eventually outside too, which is not necessarily a bad thing to be in demand. Okay, so plant your flag, tell your story, follow the new path, start teaching your material, no matter where you are in your career. And the fifth and final step, and it's the one that took me forever to learn, and it's the one that was the hardest for me to understand, was to give it all away. Now you're saying, well, Jeff, I work really hard. I've got tons of experience and expertise, and I want to be paid for it. I do too, and I want to be paid for it as well. I agree with you. You should be paid for it. The unintuitive thing here is that the more you give away, the more comes back to you, right? And so the goal here is, as you start to tell your story, is to make your work and yourself easily findable and accessible. If you don't have a platform right now, you want to use the distribution channels that have large audiences: Medium, LinkedIn, Twitter, Facebook, Instagram, TikTok, Substack, MailChimp, et cetera, et cetera, et cetera. Like there's millions of other places, YouTube, right? Places where you can share your content and your story to start to build your name. Eventually, you want to bring people into your own brand, right? So if you go to my site now, I consolidated everything on my site. Almost everything there is free. Honestly, the only thing you have to pay for on my site is either courses or books, but the articles are free, the resources are free, the downloads are free. There's a community that we've started. The community is free. Everything's given away so that people associate you with the flags that you've planted. It's extremely, extremely valuable. And so as you start to sort of give stuff away, you don't have to start huge. You don't have to start with everybody. You can start locally, right? Like the community we're in tonight, right? Give back to your community locally, give back to that community, right? Meetups and local conferences, right? Do it for free and build that momentum and then expand, right? Especially now since everything's virtual, right? I could be speaking to you in the UK. I could be speaking to somebody in Dubai or wherever from the comfort of my own home much more easily than in the past. So you have a real opportunity to give back to these communities because they will always come look for you when they need somebody with your skill set. Now, before I wrap up, I want to give you one more tactical tool and then we'll wrap this up. So how do you get started with this? I told you that there was a lot of product stuff in here as well. And one of the ways that you want to get started with this is content hypotheses. So if you've figured out where you're going to plant your flag, you can take the hypothesis statement that we use in Lean UX and Lean Startup and product discovery, right, and apply it to this exact situation, right? And you can say, look, I believe that, and the stuff in brackets and yellow is the stuff that you need to figure out, that this tactic or this content or this idea, right, provided to this target audience will achieve some kind of an outcome for them. And I'll know that I'm right when I see quantifiable changes in the behavior of my audience, right? Outcomes, right? This is the same exact stuff we do for product, but we want to apply it in this new reality, right? So if we're going to do that, right, that's what this could potentially look like, right? Let me show you kind of a completed version of this, right? So I believe that a 30-minute podcast series featuring folks from all walks of life who've turned their passions into careers, provided to mid-career knowledge workers, that's my target audience, will inspire them to create content and develop their audience networks, right? And I do have a podcast, and this is my hypothesis, right? I'll know I'm right when I see at least 500 downloads per episode and 1 weekly inbound email praising the podcast. right? I want to look for behavior that tells me that the content that I'm putting out there is resonating with folks, right? And then you can start to run experiments. You can build experiments off of this. You can release a very short podcast or 3 episodes and see what happens, right? Instead of doing 15, right? Because that's a lot of work. And so the idea is to start to think through hypotheses and success criteria in terms of user behavior, target audience behavior, to tell you whether or not you have actually provided some valuable content for these folks, okay? So to wrap this up, a few things to remember, and then I'm happy to take your questions. If you're going to go down this particular path, you have to stay relevant. In order to stay relevant, you have to stay active. This is work. It's real work, and it takes time, and you have to set time aside to do it, to create the content, to participate in the conversation, to have a presence in your industry, to share your work, to participate, basically. And so if you're going to head down this path, think about how you're going to carve time out for this. You don't need to carve out hours, right? 15 minutes a day could help you start to build a presence on Twitter or LinkedIn or some other website that makes sense for you, right? But you have to stay active. If you're thinking about sort of transitioning from one flag to another, give yourself time. That really depends. This is my experience, so yours may vary, but it's taken me a couple of years to really start to shift conversations towards helping the non-product teams do product thinking, HR especially. I've done a lot more work in HR recently than I was doing 2 years ago because I had no credentials in HR, no reason for them to listen to me. But I've spent the last couple of years writing for that audience, creating content for that audience, that they're now starting to pay attention to me. The path that I shared with you here tonight is just one. It's mine. It's what I did. It's what worked for me. So there's lots of other options. You can go through academia or executive education or whatever, right? The point here is take the pieces that make sense for you and try them out. Try them out in a small scale, experiment, get good results, and then invest more in the ideas that work. And as you go down that particular path, I'm going to close with this particular quote from Bezos, right? What Bezos talks about all the time. He says, people say, hey, Jeff, what's going to change? Jeff Bezos, not me, right? Hey, Jeff, what's going to change in the next 5 years? He said, I don't think about my business that way. I think about what is not going to change in the next 10 to 20 years, and I focus on those things, those long-term things, right? So what are people always going to need, or what are people definitely going to need in the next 10 to 20 years, right? How you deliver to solve for those needs is going to vary, right? It's going to change over time, right? Initially, it was, the U.S. Postal Service, then it was Prime, then it's drones, right, et cetera, like the way that he's delivering on those, right? The way that you deliver, the people that you deliver to may change, but that need is always going to be there. So as you think about that flag that you're planting, right, what's going to be true for the long term? Because if you focus on those long terms, it helps you build that platform to become forever employable. And so with that, I want to say just a super quick thank you for having me and listening. I hope this was valuable to you. I hope it lived up to the expectations that some of you had coming in here tonight. A couple of quick things, and then I'm happy to take your questions. If you'd like a copy of the slides, there's a link there at the top, jeffgothelf.com/slides. Happy to send you a copy of the slides. If you have any questions after the fact, that's my email address, jeff@gothelf.co. Please feel free to send me a question. People do really like the book. If you haven't picked up a copy, I would love for you to pick up a copy. And if you do, please write a review. I'm super grateful. It helps a lot. And then finally, we have a free community of folks going down this particular path called Becoming Forever Employable. If you go to becoming.foreveremployable.com, you can apply to join the community, and we let a few people in every week. It's really nice. We have conversations. We give people feedback on their content and really try to help kind of elevate everybody in the group, get them more, help them grow their audience, their network. Okay. So with that, I'll say thanks. And if there are questions, I'd be more than happy to take them.